It's our 30th lesson on Introduction to the Bible, and we'll have 2 lessons tonight and probably 1 lesson next week. That should be the end of the class. We're looking at textual criticism, continuing our study on it, and I'm going to change chairs because my other chair squeaks. The logical evaluation of certain aspects of textual criticism, we want to look at it from a logic standpoint, because when I got to studying this, I found that every single one of their major canons, they call them canons or rules, has a logical flaw in it. It's flawed logically. It has they commit a logical fallacy. But that's not strange. Atheists have done that for years. And a lot of the textual critics are agnostics or atheists. So we're going to look at 2 of the Nestle, Land, and Metzger rules of textual criticism. And we already looked at some last lesson. And we're going to look at 2 additional rules of textual criticism that have been set forth. These are the rules by which they determine which text is to be followed or to be accepted. The word canon, the first canon, remember the word canon means a rule. It's from the Greek word kanon, means a rule. And the first canon that we're going to look at is the more difficult reading is the more probable reading. And this canon has logical problems. So we're going to look at the problems logically. Since both of you are in the logic class, this should flow pretty easily. But I'll teach it like I'll go back and lay some groundwork for it for other people that wouldn't have had the logic class. The second canon is the shorter reading is the more probable reading, and it also has logical problems. We'll lay these out as well. Now, in logic, a proposition is a statement that is either true or false. Now, questions, and when we studied the logic course, we understood that there are some things that cannot be true or false. And a wish cannot be true or false. A question cannot be true or false. A statement where you're asserting a fact is either true or false. For instance, we have 4 possible ways we can take a statement or a proposition and form it. It could be an A-type proposition, which is all A or B, and then we could have an I-type proposition, all some A or B, and then we could have an E-type proposition that would be no A or B, and we could have an O-type proposition, some A or not B, and we use an A and B as our variables. And so there's only 4 ways we can word it. Now we'll have a square opposition chart. We'll go back through this again. I'll use S and N probably on the slides or on our square opposition chart. We'll go back through this one more time. And so there's only 4 ways we could word that statement. When they say the more difficult reading is more probable reading, are they saying all of the more difficult readings are more probable? Are they saying some of the more difficult readings are probable? Are they saying none of them are more difficult readings are more probable? Or are they saying some of the more difficult readings are not probable? See, there's only 4 ways they can word this. And so I would argue that they're not saying the last one or the last 2 I gave. These 3 options exhaust all the logical possibilities when we look at it. Now, the question is the words all, some, or none. See, that's how we view it. So they exhaust all of our logical possibilities. We'll show how they fit. there's really four ways, but when you get down to this, some are more difficult readings. We get a situation where we have some are and some are not. We'll show that in a minute. In practice, they don't opt for all of the more difficult readings all of the time. So they don't take the first option because they will take and reject the more difficult readings in a lot of instances. So they don't follow it all the time. So they do not take all the A-type proposition. Let's look at it. Are they saying none of the more difficult readings? Probably not. And that's not their view. This most certainly are not saying that none of the more difficult readings are the more probable readings. So by saying that they deny this, if this is false, then they have to take by process of elimination, we conclude that they're logically saying some of the more difficult readings are more probable readings. And when we use the word some, we mean one or more, okay? So they're saying some. The premise, some of the more difficult readings are more probable readings, contradicts the premise, no difficult readings are more probable readings. We'll show that on a square of opposition chart. This is the chart that's very useful once you learn to use it for evaluating what's being said and what's being affirmed, and how it can be disproven, and how we can decide what is right or what is true or false. They do not claim all the difficult readings are more probable readings. They deny this premise because they do not follow that rule. So they don't take that rule. So this implies that some of the difficult readings are not more probable readings. We'll show this with our square of opposition chart. Now, they deny the E-type proposition. My mouse moving around on it. No SRP. That is, none of the difficult readings are the probable readings. They deny that. That contradicts. And if that is false, then the I-type proposition, where my mouse is, some of the more difficult readings are probable readings, then that implies this I-type proposition is true. So they would agree with that. So they're not going to deny that. The E-type proposition, they will deny. And so they will agree with the I. And we come up to the A-type proposition. All of the more difficult readings are more probable readings. They don't go by that. They don't follow that rule. So they don't take the A-type proposition. And from logic, the A-type proposition contradicts the O-type proposition. Some are not more probable. So these two propositions, I and O, can both be true, but they cannot both be false. So they're actually claiming an I-type proposition. Some are more probable readings, and they're also agreeing and implying some are not more probable readings. I want to ask you, since the two of you have had the logic course, if some are probable and some are not probable, what can you determine from that? Help me.
Not much of anything.
You can't determine anything from it. Okay? There's no way of determining anything. Now, remember, they won't go with the E-type proposition at all. So they don't go with the E-type, absolutely, because they're saying that the more difficult readings are more probable, right? So they won't go with that. So they don't absolutely take that. So that implies the I, which they accept. And if we come up here to the A-type, no, they don't do that. In reality, a lot of times they'll not take the more difficult reading in their textual criticism. So in practice, they don't take the A. By rejecting the A, they imply the O is true, And so, and the O and I can both be true. They're subcontraries. So we can't prove anything by it. It's very interesting. The canon, the textual canon, proves absolutely nothing. The rule tells us absolutely nothing. And these are men with PhDs, and they're teaching in universities like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, and yet they don't have a grip, a handle on the logic of their arguments. It's probably nothing more than a smokescreen to conceal their actions of choosing what fits their fancy. Or they may not even realize, because we don't study logic anymore in our colleges. And you can get a PhD degree without a course in logic and without a course in deductive logic. Now, you're going to get a course in inductive reasoning, scientific method usually, okay? But you won't get it in deductive. So I think it's just a smokescreen to choose what they want. But most likely, I'm going to be charitable. I think they're just ignorant of the fact that their whole premise, their canon, is logically flawed. I'll give them that point and not press the point further. I'm not going to accuse them of being dishonest. All right, logically, the expression more probable means more than 50% probable. Well, now, how do they know more than 50% probable? 50% implies some kind of statistical method. And so now then, whenever they do that, they're claiming 50% or more. And again, there is no statistical method that they've applied to it. So they cannot talk about probability of 50% or more. More probable means 50% or more. So again, even that term is flawed. You don't have any evidence to support that claim. Are they saying all the shorter, let's look at now then, is the shorter reading the more probable reading? This is the next canon. Again, we go back to our rule. There are 4 ways to word a proposition. All of the shorter readings, are all the shorter readings are more probable? Or some of the shorter readings more probable? If all are shorter probable, then some are shorter probable. Remember, if the A is true, the I is true, the A-type proposition. So the first one is true, the second one is true. The second one could be true. Some are shorter, of the shorter readings are more probable. Could be true, and the A-type proposition, all the shorter readings are more probable, could be false, okay? So now then, or none of the shorter readings probable, all right? Now, when they say the shorter reading is more probable, they're certainly denying the none of the shorter readings are more probable. So we have to say they have denied that. So again, these 3 propositions exhaust all the logical possibilities. Now, they don't opt for all the shorter readings because they'll take the longer readings a lot of times. Right? So they don't opt for it. So certainly, homoteletion, gluton, would give a shorter text. All right, that's whenever we have it here, we omit some words, probably from homoteletion. So some words are omitted in these 2 passages. And Luke 12:18 and Luke 24:15 in 2 different manuscripts, okay? And the words sound the same, and you maybe cut a whole line out because when your eye is on the line, the line begins with the same word and you skip it. Or you may pick a word up twice, and so you'll add words. That'll be a longer text. But this is taking the shorter text. At the end of it, it's at the end of the word. The word homeo is, they sound the same, and teluton is from teleo, which is the end. The end of it sounds the same. In addition, line omission would give a shorter text, and all of it be omit a line in 1 Timothy 6:5. So these 2 old manuscripts omit a line in 1 Timothy 6:5. and they don't follow the text, in that instance, they know it's omitted a line. So are they saying none of the shorter readings? Well, no, they're most certainly not saying that none of the shorter readings, because they don't follow that at all. And their canon actually would deny that. By the process elimination, since they say that none of the shorter readings are more probable, they deny the truthfulness of that. And we conclude that they're logically saying some of the shorter readings are more probable. Let's go to our square of opposition in just a minute and see it. The premise, some of the shorter readings are more probable readings, linked with their denial that all shorter readings are more probable readings, implies that some of the shorter readings are not more probable readings. Now let's look at our next slide. We'll see this on the next slide. This implies that some of the shorter readings are, and some of the shorter readings are not more probable. So let's go back now. Let's take the E-type proposition. The E-type is none of the shorter readings are more probable. They certainly don't hold to that. So that being false, that means that this I-type is true. Some of the more shorter readings are more probable. That is true. And I would agree with that some are more probable, but not because they're necessarily shorter, for other reasons. Now, all of the short readings are more probable. They don't hold to that because they'll take the longer reading in a lot of passages, some of the illustrations we just gave. So they don't go with the A-type proposition. If the A-type proposition is false, that means the O-type proposition has to be true. We've already taken and proven the I-type proposition. Some are probable, and the O-type is some are not probable. And so we have an I and an O-type proposition, which are subcontraries, and they can both be true. In this case, they are. And again, some are probable, some are not probable. Again, what can we tell from that? What conclusion can we draw from those two premises, knowing those two premises are true? Of those two. Somebody say it again.
They like to have it both ways.
You can't determine anything.
Mm-hmm.
This canon doesn't prove a thing. It's absolutely worthless. It's logically flawed. I'm amazed that rational men would not see that. Okay? But again, we're not trained in logic in our country. Right? So we don't think logically anymore. Now, we used to be taught in our school system to think logically, but we just don't do that anymore. And that ended with the teaching of John Dewey's doctrine, pragmatism it's called, his philosophy. As the shorter reading, the more probable reading, because this conclusion, this rule tells us absolutely nothing. Now then, again, it looks like a smoke screen, choosing what fits their fancy. Now they say more probable, which means more than 50% probable. And again, they haven't done any statistics on it. They haven't done any probability on this that I've ever seen. I've not seen any evidence that they've done any mathematical probability calculations. So the term more probable is just they're shooting in the wind. They're just shooting in the dark, whistling in the wind. They have no evidence for that. So the more probable has not even been established. So again, it's just the rule doesn't tell you anything. The more probable is just thrown out there, and there's no evidence for it. Again, now they're begging the question whenever they claim it's more probable. More probable implies 50%, more than 50%. And they haven't given any evidence even for that. But the canon itself just doesn't prove anything because it's either more probable or it's not more probable. So what does that tell us? Nothing. It tells us absolutely nothing. Any comments or questions?
Has any work been done? I assume it has been to classify more according to error type?
Or they may have done some. I haven't seen any where they've actually done this. And the catalog didn't put it in any books that I read.
Okay.
Again, these textual critics don't even agree among themselves. They all have disagreements among themselves. Okay.
Okay.
Any mathematical studies that's been done on it. Now then, the next textual canon of textual criticism is a little bit more interesting because it has what's called the community of error. So when they claim that something is an error, and they've determined it's an error by these other canons that we've already shown are flawed, then they will say, okay, all of these other manuscripts read that same way, so they all have the same error. And so we consider these to be bad manuscripts because they don't read like we've determined they should read. And so it's a canon of text that has logical problems. We're going to show the logical problems on it. Caldwell's rule is misunderstood, and some textual critics commit logical fallacies in applying that rule as well. So these are the four rules we want to look at. Community of error is Souter or Souter. I always pronounce it S-O-U-T or Souter. The community of error is in the sole ground of relationship. That's what he says. And the greater that community, the closer the relationship. So whenever you have an error, they say when we have an error, now understand, they have determined the error by some flawed canons. And they will say, look, we have this error, and a whole bunch of these manuscripts have that same error in them. So these manuscripts are flawed manuscripts because they have that error. They have a community of error. And that's the sole ground of relationship. Now, they say if there's one error in a manuscript, and then a bunch of other manuscripts have that same error, then they must be related to each other in some way. Now, there's some truth to that. But again, now, how did we determine they had an error? It's another question. We've already shot down their canons for determining that. Now, I would argue, and they would argue, that once an error starts, it gets copied. And so the canon neglects the fact that if one were copying from the autograph and he copied accurately, the two manuscripts would agree they would not have errors. There would be a community of agreement instead of error. So they would agree with one another. See? Now they start out with the assumption, now understand most of these fellows are atheists or agnostics. So they start out with the assumption that the scriptures were written by flawed men that were not guided by the Holy Spirit. And consequently, they surely made some grammar and factual errors in their writings because there's no God, you see, in their thinking. And so we can't have a totally inerrant book being written. Cannot happen, see, because there's no God. Now that's their thinking. So it has to have errors in it when it starts out, okay? So if several manuscripts read the same, they all came from a common manuscript. I agree with this assumption, or they came from a common manuscript. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The second assumption, if all manuscripts came from the same manuscript, they serve as only one witness for the text. I disagree with this assumption because it might have been copied from the original or from an original manuscript. Okay? It might have been copied correctly from, and if there were thousands of correct manuscripts in the first century, there's one situation where we would not look for community error when we have the autographs. If my claim in my Holy Spirit book, it's one of my claims that I've written in Volume 2 of the Work of the Holy Spirit, that the There were inspired scribes who made exact copies of the books in the times of the age of miracles in the first century. There were probably thousands and thousands of exact copies of the books of the New Testament. If that claim is correct, then we would have a community of agreement that was a ground for relationship, not a community of error. Because we would have thousands of manuscripts that were not even made by the same scribes, but they would have exactly the same because the Holy Spirit is guiding those scribes in making those copies. Now, again, I don't think my position is widely believed or even perhaps never even understood or heard. But I'm convinced that there were scribes, and I lay this out in that volume, and lay it out in that volume, volume 2 of the Work of the Holy Spirit, published in 2005. We would have a community of agreement as a ground of relationship because we have all of these manuscripts that all read the same. Any comments or questions? All right, there is another rule that we want to look at, and this is E.C. Caldwell's rule. All right. Caldwell argues, and it's a Greek argument. Of course, we're looking only at the Greek text right now. We're not looking at the Hebrew Old Testament. And a definite predicate nouns which precede the verb, usually like the article, right? A predicate nominative which precedes the verb cannot be translated as indefinite or a qualitative noun solely because of the absence of the article. If the context suggests that the predicate is definite, it should be translated as a definite noun. Well, when we studied Greek, and you both had Greek, you learned that the article can be absent and it still could be definite. We've already seen that. And like the word father is definite, you don't have to put an article on it because there's only one. You only have one father, or your mother, or some. So some terms are by their very nature definite, without having an article. So what we see, it can be qualitative. It can be qualitative without the article. If it has an article, it's not qualitative. If it is anarthrous, no article, then it can be qualitative, expressing a quality or a nature. So that's what he's saying. So let's go back and read this again. Definite predicate nouns which precede the verb, usually like the article. A predicate nominative which precedes the verb cannot be translated as an indefinite or qualitative noun solely because of the absence of the article. If the context suggests the predicate is definite, it should be translated as a definite noun. So now he's sending you to context to determine whether it's definite or not. Now, I hope that's clear. And Caldwell is right. I believe I agree with him. I don't have any disagreement with Caldwell here. Caldwell is frequently regarded by Daniel Wallace. Now, Daniel Wallace is a well-known Baptist Greek scholar, and he holds to this text of the Nestle Aland UBS, United Bible Society text, NA, Nestle Aland, UBS, and United Bible Society text. And he says Caldwell is frequently regarded as the father of modern American New Testament textual criticism in his volume that's entitled Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, page 260. So basically, what's happening here, if two different manuscripts exist where one has the article and the other does not, the textual critic will reject the one with the article with the predicate nominative that he deems to be definite. All right? Okay? So that's what he'll do. He'll reject that. First premise, let's lay it out what they're saying. If the noun is articular, then the noun is definite. Well, that premise is true. because with the article, it's automatically definite. Transposition, if the noun is not definite, and it's not articulate. Now, this is a logical process. Reverse, we take the antecedent. In this case, it's the part after the word if and before the word then. So the antecedent, A-N-T-E-C, the ante is Latin for before. And so a noun is articular, is the antecedent. The consequent is the part after the word then. And the consequent in this one is the noun is definite, okay? So what we're going to do with this logical process, we developed this in the logic course, and we prove that Jesus and the apostles used this transposition process in their argumentation. So it's a scripturally accepted process, and it's used by Jesus and the apostles, or at least one of the apostles. So we reverse the antecedent, we trade places and negate both of them. So the antecedent, a noun is articulate, we put it at the end, it is, and then we negate it. The noun is not articular. If a noun is not definite, then it is not articular. All right. This premise is certainly true about transposition. So if it's not definite, then it's not articular. So it has to be articulate. If it's articular, it's definite. But if it's not articular, if it's not definite, it won't be articular. It can't be articular and be indefinite, okay? So if a noun is definite, then the noun is articulate. This premise is unsound. Now they turn around and change this, and they'll reverse this if it's definite. And so they'll take the word not off up here and not off the out here. If it's definite, then the noun is articular. Well, this premise is unsound. It's the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So they've turned this thing around and they've affirmed the consequent. See? And so it's unsound. They've affirmed the consequent. It's not necessary for the noun to have the article in order for it to be definite. Now, Wallace tells us that, and he's correct. But conversely, now it cannot be indefinite when it has the article. Now, that's correct. As it may be definite without the article, but it must be definite with the article. Now, that's what he's telling us. The unauthorized, no article construction can be either definite or indefinite. That's you have to go to context to tell this. So Caldwell's rule, the definite predicate nouns which precede the verb usually lack the article. Now, usually means more than half of the time, see? A predicate nominative which precedes the verb cannot be translated as an indefinite or qualitative noun solely because of the absence of the article. If the context suggests predicate is definite, it should be translated as definite noun. All right? I don't know even how Caldwell gets the word usually in here. He's just probably doing it from his experience. Most of the time that would be the case, right? Right? And he probably has done his work on that. Now, here's this unsound claim of using Caldwell's rule. I think misusing his rule. I don't think Caldwell, I think he's dead, and I don't think he took it the way I think they logically mishandled his rule. That's what they've done. Here's the first premise. If a definite predicate nominative precedes a verb, then the predicate nominative is unauthorized. Right? That's their claim. They have reasoned that if a definite predicate noun has the article, it must be a corrupted text. That's what they have reasoned. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, there's sometimes that they will take a text that has a predicate nominative that has the article, and they'll not take it as a corrupted text. So they don't go with that all the time. The assumption is all definite predicate nominatives are unauthorized, and that assumption is not true. A definite predicate noun that precedes the verb usually like the article is what Caldwell says. Doesn't say always, see? So it's not an A-type proposition. Logically, that means more than 50% of the time. Usually does not mean all the time. Usually does not mean none of the time. So we ruled out the E-type proposition. Usually means some of the time. All right? Get into this. Caldwell is not saying all the time by his rule. He must be saying some of the time the definite predicate nominative is articulate or arthurous. Arthurous is the way of saying it has the article, okay? The point is drawn from the square of opposition on the next slide. You're not saying all of the time it's an arthurous, all right? All right. Let's go back and see. He's not saying all the time by this rule, some of the time. Let's see what we're saying now. Definite predicate nouns which precede the verb usually like the article. So it's anarthrous. It doesn't have the article. It lacks the article. Everyone clear is what anarthrous means. It doesn't have the article. Let's go back. He's not saying all the time it's anarthrous. It lacks the article. They're not saying none of the time it is. So they have denied the truthfulness of the A-type proposition. So they're saying some of the time it lacks the article, and they're not saying none of the time it lacks the article. So they're not saying that. So that implies the I-type proposition. Some of the time it lacks the article, and some of the time it does not lack the article. For crying out loud, we get into the same problem we got into with the other canons. These two, the I and the O-type propositions, are subcontraries. They cannot both be false, but they can both be true. And in fact, in our situation here with his rule, we have them both being true. So if we go back to Caldwell's rule, his rule says some of the time it is, some of the time it's not. And he says, usually, let's go back to his rule again. We can see what he actually says. Usually, and I'll put my mouse over it, usually like the rule. He's not saying all the time. He's saying some of the time it does, some of the time it doesn't. You can't draw any conclusions from this. Any questions? All right. Caldwell's rule is useless in textual criticism. Completely useless. It may or may not be the case. So how am I going to tell? Let's look at some other rule. Well, these other rules, we've already shot them down too. They all have logical flaws. From a square of opposition in charts, obviously that no logical conclusion can be derived from the Caldwell's rule. Since one cannot logically draw a sound conclusion from Caldwell's rule, it's useless in textual criticism. Now, he might take instances, but he has to use context to tell whether it's definite or indefinite. And context gets into where one's opinion, it gets into the problem with our biases, for instance. If the context suggests that the predicate is definite, it should be translated by as a definite noun. Caldwell, and that's true. I agree with Caldwell. But the determination of the context is usually subjective in nature, at least somewhat subjective. This makes the application of Caldwell's rule to be subjective. And so it's a subjective rule. Any questions? All right. One cannot draw any logical conclusion from a textual canon. The more difficult readings, the most probable readings, therefore, a canon is useless. One cannot draw any logical conclusions from a textual canon. The shortest reading is the more probable reading. Therefore, this canon is useless. I draw a logical conclusion from the textual canon. Community of error is in the sole ground of relationship, and the greater the community, the closer the relationship. Therefore, this canon is useless. One cannot draw any logical conclusion from Caldwell's rule. Therefore, Caldwell's rule is useless in textual criticism. 4, the basic rules of textual criticism are shown to be irrational. We need to reject all systems of textual criticism based on any or all of these rules. Are there questions or comments?